Morning on the outskirts of Cairo begins with familiar sounds. The slow ignition of an old bus engine, the call of a bread seller echoing along a dusty road. Wind carries the smell of the river mixed with smoke and sand. People move as they do every day, unhurried, uninterrupted. In the distance, the Nile continues to flow, quiet and steady, as it has for thousands of years. There are no historical signs, no monumental markers, only a flat stretch of land where modern life unfolds as if nothing else had ever existed here before. Yet it is precisely here that a city once stood at the center of an entire civilization, not through towering stone, not through constant conquest, but through a quieter form of power, control over life itself. The contrast lies in plain sight. On one side, a fragmented present, where the past survives only as a name in books. On the other, the memory of a capital that once coordinated flood seasons, farmland, and human labor on an unprecedented scale. How could a place that once anchored ancient Egypt fade so completely into the modern landscape? The central question of this narrative does not begin with pyramids, nor with pharaohs. It begins with a river, with water rising and retreating each year, with human decisions to stay or to leave. What led to the founding of a city precisely at the fragile boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt? How did Memphis not only survive, but become a center of authority, food distribution, and order for centuries? And what happened in between, when the current of history shifted, when trade routes changed, when power slowly drifted away from the river? There is no single cause in this story. There were conflicts, but they were not decisive. There were beliefs, but they were not the original foundation. There were people, migration, ambition, and costly misjudgments. Memphis did not emerge from glory, but from necessity. And it was this necessity that gave it strength, until the world around it no longer required what it once provided. This narrative follows a journey upstream through time, returning to layers of earth first soaked by floodwater, where canals were carved not only to irrigate fields, but to organize society itself. Through archaeological evidence, ancient records, and AI-assisted reconstructions, we step into a city no longer clearly visible on the modern map, yet one that once shaped the fate of an entire kingdom. A city created by the Nile, and ultimately carried away by the passage of time. If you are ready, the journey begins where everything once started. You are standing on a wide stretch of land where the ground feels undecided. To the south, the river narrows, pressed in by higher ground. To the north, it begins to loosen, spreading outward into low fields and marshes. The air smells of wet soil and vegetation left behind by retreating water. There are no walls yet, no palaces, no clear streets, only footpaths pressed into mud, clusters of huts built from reed and clay, and people watching the river as closely as they watch one another. This is not yet a city. It is a threshold. What defines this place, before any name is spoken, is position. Here, the Nile slows just enough to be measured. Floodwaters arrive predictably, but not gently. Each year, they erase boundaries and then redraw them. Communities upstream and downstream depend on the same cycle, yet experience it differently. Because this land sits between Upper and Lower Egypt, it becomes a point of negotiation. Whoever lives here must learn not only how to survive the flood, but how to anticipate it. As simple irrigation channels appear, something changes. Control over water becomes control over timing. Timing becomes control over crops, and crops begin to bind people together in ways hunting and herding never did. As food production stabilizes, movement slows. Families stop migrating with the seasons and begin returning to the same ground year after year. Storage pits are dug, grain is guarded. Surpluses appear, modest at first, then more deliberate. With surplus comes obligation. Someone must measure, someone must record, someone must decide who receives food when the flood fails or arrives too strongly. Authority does not arrive with crowns or armies. It emerges quietly, through administration, through the management of risk. Daily life here is shaped by waiting and preparation. People repair embankments before the flood and rebuild homes after it recedes. Children learn to read the river's surface, to notice shifts in colour and speed. Farmers work collectively because no single household can maintain canals alone. Disputes are settled with reference to water rights rather than lineage. Survival depends less on individual strength and more on coordination. Over time, rituals develop around the flood, not as abstract belief, but as collective memory encoded in practice. By the time the first leaders are recognized, the landscape has already trained the society that supports them. This place does not dominate Egypt through force. It connects Egypt through function. It becomes the point where flow is slowed, measured, and redirected. What begins as a settlement at a natural boundary starts to behave like a center. And once a center forms, it draws more than water. It draws people, labor, attention, and eventually power. The land has done its work. The next transformation will not come from nature alone, but from those who learn how to speak in its name. You are now standing in a place that feels more deliberate. Paths have widened into recognizable routes. Structures cluster closer together, built higher from the ground to escape the flood's reach. The smell of wet clay mixes with smoke from hearth fires that burn longer than before. You hear voices not just calling across fields, but issuing instructions. Someone is counting. Someone is watching. The river is still present, but it is no longer the only thing commanding attention. As population increases, coordination becomes necessity rather than choice. The same canals that once served neighboring families now link multiple settlements. Managing them requires rules. Rules require authority. Because this land sits at the hinge between Upper and Lower Egypt, it becomes the ideal place to unify systems that were once separate. Measurement standards are introduced so grain can be counted the same way upstream and downstream. Seasonal labor is organized to maintain embankments before the flood arrives. What begins as practical oversight slowly hardens into governance. This is where Memphis begins to change in nature. Its power does not come from distance or defense, but from centralization. Decisions made here ripple outward along the river. When disputes arise between regions, this location offers neutrality through function. It controls storage, redistribution, and scheduling. Over time, leaders who oversee these systems acquire symbolic authority. They are no longer simply organizers. They become representatives of balance between the two lands. For ordinary people, life becomes more structured. Work follows calendars rather than instinct. Taxes are paid not in coin, but in grain and labor. Some individuals stop farming altogether and specialize. Scribes begin recording deliveries. Craftsmen produce tools not just for use, but for exchange. Markets emerge near storage areas, drawing traders who follow the river's rhythm. Daily survival is now tied to an expanding network rather than a single plot of land. With this shift comes a new relationship to power. People do not see rulers daily, but they feel their presence in allocations, in required labor, in protected reserves during poor floods. Authority becomes abstract, embedded in systems rather than personalities. Memphis grows not by conquest, but by becoming indispensable. To participate in the larger order forming along the Nile is to pass through its mechanisms. As these systems stabilize, belief begins to follow structure. The river's cycles are no longer just observed, they are interpreted. Order is no longer just maintained, It is justified. What began as environmental management is now laying the groundwork for ideology. And in the next phase, Memphis will no longer simply manage Egypt's balance. It will claim to embody it. You are standing before structures that rise with intent. They are no longer temporary or purely functional. Walls are thicker, foundations are squared, courtyards open toward the river, aligned with care rather than convenience. You sense that space here is being organized not only for living, but for meaning. The sounds have changed as well. Ritual chants mix with administrative commands. The city now speaks in two voices, one practical, one symbolic. As authority consolidates, it seeks permanence. Leadership here begins to draw legitimacy not only from its ability to manage water and food, but from its claim to reflect cosmic order. The flood is no longer just a natural event, it becomes a sign. Balance between Upper and Lower Egypt is framed as harmony rather than negotiation. Memphis positions itself as the point where this harmony is maintained. Because it already coordinates resources, it becomes the natural place to coordinate belief. Temples rise near administrative centers. Priests and scribes work side by side, recording offerings as carefully as grain deliveries. Religious rituals follow the same calendars used for agriculture and labor. This alignment is not accidental. By tying divine order to seasonal cycles, authority becomes difficult to separate from survival itself. When the flood arrives on time, it confirms the system. When it fails, explanations are offered that reinforce the need for obedience and correction. For the people, daily life becomes layered. Farmers still tend fields and repair canals, but they now participate in ceremonies that affirm their place within a larger order. Artisans produce objects meant to endure, statues, reliefs, ritual tools. Burial practices become more formalized, reflecting belief in continuity beyond life. The city's rhythms extend beyond daylight and harvest. They now include festivals, processions, and moments of collective pause. This stage marks a critical shift. Memphis is no longer only a center of coordination, it becomes a center of representation. Power is made visible through architecture, through ceremony, through the careful repetition of symbols. The city presents itself as timeless, even as it continues to adapt. Yet, permanence carries weight. The systems that stabilize society also bind it. As Memphis anchors ideology and administration together, it becomes less flexible. The river still flows. Trade still moves. But the world beyond this center is growing wider, more connected, and less dependent on a single point of balance. The foundations are now set. What comes next will test whether a city built to embody order can respond when that order begins to shift. You are moving through a city that still commands respect, but no longer unquestioned attention. The riverfront is busier now, crowded with vessels from distant regions. Accents shift. Goods, unfamiliar to earlier generations, pass through storage halls built for grain alone. The air carries new smells, resins, metals, foreign textiles. Memphis remains orderly, but it is no longer isolated at the center of everything that moves. As trade expands beyond the Nile corridor, the logic that once favored Memphis begins to loosen. River control still matters, but influence now flows along routes that stretch outward toward the Mediterranean, the Sinai, and deeper into Africa. Political gravity responds accordingly. Administrative focus starts to drift northward, closer to coastal exchange points and emerging hubs of international commerce. Memphis does not fall. It is simply bypassed. This shift alters how power is exercised. Decision-making becomes more distant. Royal presence grows intermittent. Authority, once embedded in daily systems of distribution and ritual, becomes more symbolic than operational. The city continues to host ceremonies and maintain temples, but fewer decisions that shape the future originate here. Systems remain, but initiative migrates elsewhere. For the people, adaptation is gradual and uneven. Some households benefit from new trade, finding work as transporters, craftsmen, or intermediaries. Others find their skills less valued as economic focus changes. Agricultural routines persist, but state investment in local infrastructure slows. Maintenance becomes reactive rather than anticipatory. Small failures begin to accumulate. Yet Memphis does not lose its identity. Its temples continue to function. Its archives still preserve memory. It becomes a city of reference, a place where legitimacy is invoked even as power operates elsewhere. The past remains present, heavy but authoritative. This stage is not collapse, it is reorientation. Memphis shifts from being the engine of coordination to being its symbol. And symbols endure longer than systems, but they also adapt more slowly. As new centers rise and the world stretches beyond the rhythm of a single river, Memphis enters a quieter phase. Its influence no longer shapes the future directly, but it continues to frame how that future understands its origins. The next transition will not come from sudden destruction, but from the steady erosion of necessity. You are walking through spaces that feel larger than their purpose now requires. Courtyards echo. Doorways open onto rooms used less often. The river still passes nearby, but the city no longer listens to it in the same way. What once demanded constant calculation now flows past without instruction. Memphis remains inhabited, but it is no longer essential. Power has moved on. New capitals host administration, new ports direct trade. Decisions that shape livelihoods are made elsewhere. In Memphis, institutions persist out of habit rather than necessity. Temples continue their rituals. Priests preserve calendars whose authority comes from tradition more than outcome. Archives are maintained not to guide the present, but to remember the past. The city becomes a keeper of continuity rather than a driver of change. For ordinary people, life simplifies and contracts. Fewer large projects require collective labor. Fewer officials arrive to inspect or redistribute. Families rely more on local networks than state systems. Some migrate toward emerging centers. Others remain bound by land, memory, or occupation. Memphis offers stability without opportunity, safety without momentum. The meaning of the city shifts. It becomes symbolic terrain. Rulers invoke it to legitimize their authority, even when they govern from afar. Pilgrims arrive seeking connection to origins rather than advantage. Memphis no longer organizes Egypt, but it anchors its sense of historical depth. What was once functional power becomes cultural gravity. This transformation is quiet. There is no single moment of abandonment. Buildings, weather, canals, silt, neighborhoods thin. The city does not vanish, it fades. Each generation leaves a little less behind than the one before. Yet this fading carries a lesson. Memphis was created to solve a problem. When that problem changed, the city did not fail. It simply became something else. Its survival lies not in endurance as a capital, but in persistence as memory. As the rhythms of empire continue to shift, Memphis settles into the long afterlife that follows relevance. And from that afterlife, it will speak to the present in ways only distance allows. The present returns quietly. The same stretch of land near the river, the same road where vehicles pass without slowing, the same wind carrying dust and water together. Nothing announces that this place once shaped an entire civilization. Yet, beneath the ground, layers of decisions remain. The measurements, the canals, the calendars. The habits of organization that once held a kingdom together. What looks empty is not absent, it is compressed. Seen this way, the modern landscape no longer feels accidental. It rests on inherited logic. The rhythm of agriculture still follows the river. Administrative boundaries echo ancient divisions. Even the idea that stability depends on coordination rather than force has deep roots here. Memphis no longer governs, but its way of thinking persists, embedded in how people manage land, labor, and risk. This history does not tell a story of triumph or failure. It speaks instead about adaptation. Memphis rose because it solved a problem no one else could at the time. It declined when that problem evolved. There was no betrayal of destiny, no moral collapse, only changing conditions. The city reminds us that human systems are strongest when they remain aligned with the forces that sustain them, and most fragile when they mistake permanence for inevitability. To look at Memphis today is to confront a simple truth. Power does not disappear. It relocates. It changes form. What once required a city can later exist as an idea, a method, a memory passed forward without ceremony. The Nile still flows. People still depend on it, but no single place controls it anymore. As this narrative closes, the invitation is not to mourn what has faded, but to recognize what endures. To ask which of our own centers exist because they meet real needs, and which survive only because they once did. The land will not answer. The river will not explain, but the traces remain, waiting to be read by those willing to look beyond what is visible. And in that quiet space between water and earth, the story continues.